The shot rang out just as Olivia Brennan reached for the water bucket, and the horse she had been standing beside reared up in terror, its hooves catching her square in the chest and sending her flying backward into the unforgiving Nevada dust. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs, pain exploding through her ribs and down her left leg with such intensity that black spots danced across her vision like a swarm of angry hornets. The bucket clattered away, precious water spilling into the thirsty earth as more gunfire erupted from somewhere near the saloon, and Olivia tried to push herself up, tried to crawl toward the relative safety of the livery stable. But her leg would not obey her commands, and her chest felt as though someone had driven a railroad spike through it. The year was 1877, and Unionville, Nevada had seen better days. The silver mines that once promised fortune to every man willing to break his back in the dark tunnels had played out years ago, leaving behind a skeleton crew of stubborn souls who refused to admit defeat. Olivia had arrived 3 months earlier with her Aunt Margaret, a widow who had inherited a boarding house from a distant cousin. Margaret had died within 6 weeks of their arrival, succumbing to pneumonia during a late spring cold snap, and Olivia found herself alone in a dying town with nothing but the boarding house, a dwindling supply of canned goods, and the growing realization that she might have made a terrible mistake leaving Kansas. She lay there in the dust now, watching the sky spin above her, hearing shouts and the thunder of boots on wooden planks as men ran toward or away from whatever trouble had erupted. Her leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and when she tried again to move it, white-hot agony shot up her spine and she cried out despite herself. The sound was lost in the chaos, and Olivia felt tears of frustration and fear sliding down her temples into her hair. She was 22 years old, alone in a town of rough men and rougher prospects, and she was going to die in the street like a dog. Then a shadow fell across her, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun, and a voice said, "Easy now, miss. Do not try to move." Olivia blinked away the tears and found herself looking up at a man who knelt beside her with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to tending wounded creatures. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. His face was sun-browned and angular, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble, and he wore the dusty clothes of a working cowboy, denim and leather worn soft by time and use. A battered hat hung down his back by a leather cord, and his hands, when they moved to gently probe her ribs, were calloused but surprisingly gentle. "Can you breathe?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Hurts," Olivia managed, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I imagine it does. That horse caught you good. I saw the whole thing from across the street." His fingers moved carefully along her ribcage, and she hissed in pain. "Nothing broken in your ribs, I think, but they will be bruised something fierce. Your leg, though, that is another matter." He shifted his attention downward, and Olivia followed his gaze to see her left leg bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch. The cowboy's expression remained calm, but she saw something flicker in those storm-colored eyes that might have been concern. "I cannot walk," she said, stating the obvious because her mind seemed unable to form more complex thoughts. "No, you cannot," he agreed. "And we need to get you out of this street before those idiots start shooting again." As if to emphasize his point, another shot rang out, this one farther away. The cowboy did not even flinch. "My name is Franklin Voss. I work the cattle ranch about 10 miles north of here. I am going to pick you up now, and it is going to hurt, but I will be as careful as I can. Where do you need to go?" "The boarding house," Olivia said. "2 streets over, the white building with blue shutters." Franklin nodded once, then slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. Hold on to me, he instructed, and when she wrapped her arms around his neck, he lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through her leg and ribs, and Olivia bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. She tasted blood and pressed her face against Franklin's shoulder, breathing in the scent of horse and leather and honest sweat. He carried her through the dusty streets with long, purposeful strides, his arms steady and strong around her. Olivia was aware of people watching from doorways and windows, aware of the whispers that would follow this spectacle, but she was in too much pain to care about propriety. Franklin Voss did not seem concerned about the attention either. He kept his eyes forward and his pace steady, navigating around a water trough and a broken wagon wheel without breaking stride. "Which one?" he asked when they reached the street she had indicated. "There, the one with the sign," Olivia said, lifting one hand weakly to point at the building that had been her home for the past 3 months. Franklin mounted the steps to the porch and waited while she fumbled with the door handle, then carried her inside to the small sitting room just off the entrance. He lowered her onto the worn sofa with the same careful attention he had shown throughout, making sure her injured leg was supported before straightening up. "You have anyone here who can look after you?" he asked, his eyes scanning the quiet house. "No," Olivia admitted, the word tasting bitter. "My aunt died last month. I have been managing the boarding house alone." Franklin's expression shifted, something that might have been sympathy crossing his features. "You have any boarders currently?" "One, but he works at the assay office and will not be back until evening." The cowboy nodded slowly, then seemed to come to some internal decision. He pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his belt. "Then, I suppose I will need to fetch the doctor and stay until he arrives. You should not be alone with injuries like these." "You do not have to do that," Olivia said, though the protest was weak even to her own ears. The truth was she was terrified of being left alone, terrified that her leg was broken beyond repair, terrified of what would become of her if she could not work. "I know I do not have to," Franklin said simply, "but I am going to anyway." He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "My mother raised me to believe that when you see someone in need, you help them. I will be back shortly with Doc Patterson." He was gone before Olivia could respond, and she lay on the sofa listening to his boots on the porch steps, then the sound of them fading into the distance. The pain in her leg had settled into a deep, throbbing ache that made her feel nauseous, and her ribs protested every breath. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the prayers her mother had taught her as a child, but all she could think about was the man with storm-colored eyes who had appeared out of nowhere to help her. True to his word, Franklin returned within 20 minutes with Doc Patterson, a grizzled man in his 60s who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for longer than Olivia had been alive. The doctor set down his worn leather bag and gave Olivia a quick, assessing look before turning to Franklin. "Get some water boiling," he instructed, "and find me some clean cloth for bandages. This young lady is going to need some tending." While Franklin moved to comply, Doc Patterson examined Olivia with efficient, practiced movements. He felt along her ribs, listened to her breathing, and then turned his attention to her leg. His weathered face remained professionally neutral, but Olivia saw him exchange a glance with Franklin that made her heart sink. "How bad?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your leg is not broken," Doc Patterson said, which made relief flood through her until he continued. "But you have torn something in your knee, and there is significant damage to the muscles and tendons. The horse's hoof caught you at just the wrong angle. You will not be walking for several weeks at minimum, and even then, you will need to take it very slow. Too much too soon, and you could cripple yourself permanently." Several weeks. The words echoed in Olivia's mind like a death knell. How was she supposed to manage the boarding house if she could not walk? How would she cook, clean, carry water, tend the small garden that provided vegetables? The boarding house barely made enough to keep her fed as it was. If she could not work, she would lose everything. "I understand," she heard herself say, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. Doc Patterson began the process of wrapping her knee, and Olivia gritted her teeth against the pain. Franklin appeared with a pot of hot water and clean cloths torn from what looked like an old shirt, and he hovered nearby, ready to help but staying out of the doctor's way. When the examination and treatment were finally finished, Doc Patterson left her with instructions to rest, keep the leg elevated, and send for him if she developed a fever or if the swelling got worse. "I will check on you in a few days," he said, snapping his bag closed. "In the meantime, you need someone to look after you. Do you have any friends in town who could stay with you?" Olivia thought of the women she had met in her brief time in Unionville. There was Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store and had been kind but distant. There was Sarah Collins, who worked at the hotel and had invited Olivia to church once, but they were hardly close. The truth was that Olivia had been so focused on keeping the boarding house running after her aunt's death that she had not had time to form real friendships. "I will manage," she said, the lie transparent even to her own ears. "She will not be alone," Franklin said quietly from where he stood near the window. "I will make sure she has what she needs." Both Olivia and Doc Patterson turned to stare at him. The cowboy met their gazes steadily, his expression serious. "Mr. Voss, that is very kind, but you must have your own work to attend to," Olivia said. "I cannot ask you to play nursemaid to a stranger." "You are not asking. I am offering," Franklin replied. "And as for my work, I have some time. The cattle drive does not start for another 3 weeks, and the boss owes me some days off anyway. I can stay in town for a while, make sure you are settled." "That would not be proper," Olivia protested weakly, though propriety seemed like a luxury she could ill afford at the moment. "More proper than you trying to manage alone and hurting yourself worse," Franklin countered. "I will take a room here as a boarder if it makes you feel better about it. You do still have rooms available, do you not?" "Yes, but—" "Then it is settled." "Doc Patterson, what does she need in terms of care?" The doctor looked between them for a long moment, then seemed to decide that Franklin Voss was sincere in his offer. He rattled off instructions about keeping the leg elevated, applying cold compresses to reduce swelling, helping her move when necessary, but not letting her put weight on the injured leg, and watching for signs of infection or fever. Franklin listened with the focused attention of a man memorizing important information, asking questions when something was unclear. After Doc Patterson left, Franklin pulled a chair close to the sofa and sat down, his elbows resting on his knees as he regarded Olivia with those steady storm-colored eyes. "I know you do not know me," he said. "And I know this whole situation is unusual, but I meant what I said. I will help you until you are back on your feet. No strings attached, no expectations, just one person helping another." Olivia studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but all she saw was honest concern. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this for someone you have never met?" Franklin was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "5 years ago, my sister took a fall from a horse, broke her back. She was alone when it happened, tried to crawl back to the house but did not make it. By the time my father and I found her, it was too late. She had been lying in the sun for hours, and between the injury and the heat, her body just gave out." He looked away, his jaw tight. "She was 19 years old. If someone had been there to help her, to get her to shelter and fetch the doctor, she might have lived. So when I saw you lying in that street, I thought about Emma, and I knew I could not just walk away." The raw honesty in his words left Olivia momentarily speechless. She saw the grief still fresh in his eyes despite the passage of time, understood that his offer of help came from a place of genuine compassion born from loss. "I am very sorry about your sister," she said softly. "And I am grateful for your help, truly. I just do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Franklin said firmly. "You are a woman who needs help, and I am in a position to provide it. That is all there is to it." He stood up and moved toward the kitchen. "Now, when was the last time you ate? I am going to make you some supper, and then we can talk about what needs to be done around here to keep things running while you heal." Over the next few hours, Olivia discovered that Franklin Voss was a man of his word. He moved through her kitchen with surprising competence, heating up a pot of soup and slicing bread with practiced efficiency. He brought her a bowl and made sure she ate it all, then helped her navigate the awkward and embarrassing process of getting to the privy with his support. His manner so matter-of-fact and professional that some of her mortification faded. When her one boarder, Mr. Fletcher, returned that evening, Franklin introduced himself and explained the situation. The elderly assayer listened with concern, expressed his sympathies to Olivia, and assured her that he was perfectly capable of fending for himself for a few weeks if needed. He paid Franklin for a room, and the cowboy took the one at the far end of the hall, the one that gave him a view of the street. That night, as Olivia lay in her own bed on the ground floor, her injured leg propped on pillows and her ribs aching with every breath, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she had been alone and struggling but managing. Now she was injured and dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had his own ghosts to contend with. She did not know what the coming weeks would bring, but as she drifted toward sleep, she found herself oddly comforted by the knowledge that Franklin Voss was in the house, that she was not entirely alone after all. The next morning, Olivia woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, and for a moment she forgot about her injuries and tried to sit up. The resulting pain quickly reminded her of yesterday's events, and she fell back against the pillows with a gasp. "Easy there," came Franklin's voice from the doorway. He entered carrying a tray with a cup of coffee, a plate of eggs and bacon, and a slice of buttered toast. "Doc Patterson said you need to stay off that leg as much as possible for at least a week. That means I am bringing meals to you." "You do not have to cook for me," Olivia protested, though the food smelled wonderful and her stomach growled in appreciation. "Well, someone has to eat this food, and it might as well be you," Franklin said with a hint of amusement. He set the tray across her lap and stepped back. "Besides, I am a decent enough cook. Spent enough years on cattle drives where it was either learn to cook or starve. A man gets tired of burnt beans pretty quickly." Olivia took a tentative bite of the eggs and found them surprisingly good, fluffy and seasoned with just a touch of salt and pepper. "These are excellent," she admitted. "Do not sound so surprised," Franklin said, but there was warmth in his tone. "I have hidden talents." He moved to the window and adjusted the curtains to let in more light without the glare hitting her directly. "I checked on the garden this morning. Needs watering. And there is a pile of laundry that looks like it has been waiting for attention. If you tell me what needs doing, I can handle the basic upkeep of the place." They spent the next hour with Olivia explaining the daily operations of the boarding house. There was water to be hauled from the well, the garden to be tended, basic cleaning to be done, and meals to be prepared for any boarders who paid for them. Mr. Fletcher generally took care of his own meals, but there were occasional travelers who stayed for a night or two and expected breakfast included with their room. Franklin listened carefully, asking practical questions and making mental notes. Then he surprised her by pulling out a small notebook and pencil from his shirt pocket and actually writing things down. "I have a terrible memory for details," he explained when he caught her watching. "If I do not write it down, I will forget half of what you told me by the time I get to the kitchen." There was something endearing about this admission, this glimpse of vulnerability from a man who otherwise seemed supremely capable. Olivia found herself relaxing slightly, the tension she had been carrying since yesterday beginning to ease. "You really do not have to do all this," she said, feeling compelled to give him one more chance to escape this situation. Franklin looked up from his notebook, his storm-colored eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "Yes, I do," he said simply. "Now you need to rest that leg. I am going to take care of the morning chores and then I will check back in a few hours. If you need anything before then, you call out." "I will hear you." He left before she could protest further, and Olivia heard him moving around the house, the sound of his boots on the wooden floors oddly comforting. She finished her breakfast and set the tray aside, then lay back and tried to follow Doc Patterson's instructions about resting. But her mind was too active, worrying about money, about the boarding house, about what would happen if Franklin tired of playing caretaker and left before she could manage on her own. The days fell into a pattern. Franklin rose early and took care of the heavy work around the boarding house. He hauled water, tended the garden, and even managed to fix a broken step on the front porch that Olivia had been meaning to address for weeks. He cooked simple but satisfying meals, brought them to her on a tray, and checked on her regularly throughout the day. In the evenings, after the chores were done, he would sit in the chair beside her bed or the sofa, depending on where she was resting, and they would talk. At first, the conversations were stilted and awkward, both of them unsure what to say to each other. But gradually, as the days passed, they began to share pieces of themselves. Franklin told her about growing up on a ranch in Montana, about his father who was a hard man but fair, about his mother who had died when he was 12, about his sister Emma who had been the light of their family until the accident took her. He spoke about his years working cattle drives, about the freedom and loneliness of the trail, about the men he had worked with and the places he had seen. Olivia, in turn, told him about her childhood in Kansas, about her father who had been a school teacher, and her mother who had died of cholera when Olivia was 15. She told him about the years she had spent keeping house for her father, about his death 2 years ago that had left her alone and searching for a new purpose. She told him about her Aunt Margaret's letter, the promise of a new life in Nevada, and the crushing disappointment of watching her aunt die just weeks after their arrival. "I keep thinking I made a terrible mistake coming here," Olivia admitted one evening about a week after her injury. She was sitting on the sofa now, her leg propped on a cushion, and Franklin was in his usual chair with a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. "But the truth is, I had nowhere else to go. My father left debts, and after those were settled, there was barely enough for my train ticket west." "Nevada is not Kansas, that is for certain," Franklin said. "But it has its own kind of beauty if you know where to look, and Unionville may be dying, but it is not dead yet. There are good people here, people who look out for each other when times get hard." "Like you," Olivia said softly. Franklin looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I am just doing what anyone would do." "No," Olivia said firmly. "What you are doing goes far beyond common decency. You have put your own life on hold to help a stranger, and I want you to know that I see that and I am grateful." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something passed between them in that moment. some unspoken recognition that this situation had become more than just a cowboy helping an injured woman. There was a connection forming, fragile as new spring growth but real nonetheless. Franklin cleared his throat and looked away, but Olivia saw the color rise in his tanned cheeks. "Well, I should let you get some rest," he said, standing up. "Do you need anything before I turn in?" "No, I am fine. Thank you, Franklin." He paused at the doorway and looked back at her. "Call me Frank," he said. "My friends call me Frank. Then you should call me Olivia, not Miss Brennan." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, making him look younger and more carefree. "Good night, Olivia." "Good night, Frank." After he left, Olivia lay in the darkness and thought about that smile, about the way her name had sounded in his low, steady voice. She thought about the careful way he helped her move from bed to sofa, the gentle pressure of his hands supporting her weight, the warmth of his body when she had to lean against him. She thought about how safe she felt with him in the house, how the fear and loneliness that had been her constant companions since Aunt Margaret's death had receded in the face of his quiet presence. She was falling for him, she realized, with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. It was too soon, too fast, too improbable, and yet the feeling was undeniable. Franklin Voss, with his sad eyes and careful hands and unexpected kindness, had found his way past her defenses without even trying. The question was, did he feel the same way? And what would happen when she was healed, and he had no more reason to stay by the end of the second week? Olivia was able to move around a little with the help of a crutch that Frank had fashioned from a piece of sturdy wood and some padding. The pain in her ribs had faded to a dull ache, and while her knee was still swollen and tender, Doc Patterson declared himself cautiously optimistic about her recovery. "Another 2 weeks of taking it easy, and you should be able to start putting a bit of weight on it," the doctor said during one of his visits. "But I mean it, Miss Brennan. Easy does it. You rush this and you will regret it." Frank had been present during the examination, and Olivia did not miss the way he nodded along with the doctor's instructions, clearly memorizing them to make sure she followed them to the letter. After Doc Patterson left, Frank helped her back to the sofa and then stood there with his arms crossed, his expression serious. "I know what you are thinking," he said. "Oh, and what am I thinking?" Olivia asked, amused despite herself. "You are thinking that now you can move around a bit. You do not need me anymore. You are thinking about thanking me kindly and sending me on my way." Olivia opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again because he was at least partly right. She had been thinking that she could not continue to impose on his kindness indefinitely, that he must be eager to get back to his own life. "I am thinking that you have already given up 2 weeks of your life for me, and the cattle drive must be getting close," she said carefully. "I do not want you to lose your job because you were helping me." "The cattle drive does not start for another week and a half," Frank said. "And I talked to my boss. He is holding my spot, so that excuse does not work." He moved closer and sat down on the edge of the chair, his elbows resting on his knees as he leaned toward her. "Olivia, I am not staying here out of obligation anymore. I am staying because I want to." Her heart did a complicated flutter in her chest. "Why?" Frank looked at her for a long moment, and she saw a dozen emotions cross his face before he finally spoke. "Because these past 2 weeks have been the best 2 weeks I have had in a long time. Because I wake up in the morning and the first thing I think about is making sure you have a good breakfast. Because I like talking to you in the evenings, like hearing about your life and your thoughts. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about helping a stranger and started being about spending time with a woman I have come to care for a great deal." The honesty in his words stole Olivia's breath. She stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing, afraid that if she spoke she would somehow break the spell of this moment. Frank reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, his grip gentle but firm. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we have only known each other 2 weeks, but I also know what I feel, and I think maybe you might feel something too. Am I wrong?" "No," Olivia whispered. "You are not wrong." The smile that spread across Frank's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, full of light and warmth and joy. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I would like to court you properly if you will let me," he said. "I know the timing is strange, and I know I am just a cowboy with more experience with cattle than with women, but I promise I will do my best to make you happy." Olivia felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I would like that very much," she said. They sat there for a long moment, hands clasped, smiling at each other like fools, and Olivia thought about the strange path that had led her to this moment. She had fallen in the street, broken and alone, and this man had knelt down beside her and promised to carry her home. He had kept that promise in ways she never could have imagined, carrying her not just physically but emotionally, helping her shoulder burdens she had been trying to manage alone. "I should warn you," Frank said, his tone becoming more serious. "I am not a wealthy man. I make a decent wage working cattle, but it is not much. I have been saving money with the idea of maybe buying a small place of my own someday, building up a herd slowly. It is going to be years before I can offer you the kind of life you deserve." "Frank," Olivia said gently, squeezing his hand. "I do not need wealth. I need kindness and honesty and someone who will be there when things get hard. You have already shown me you are that kind of man. Everything else we can figure out together." He let out a breath she had not realized he was holding. "I am going to have to leave in 10 days for the cattle drive. I will be gone for at least 2 months, maybe 3. The thought of him leaving sent a pang through Olivia's chest, but she understood. This was his work, his livelihood. "I know, and I will be here when you get back. Will you?" Frank asked, and there was vulnerability in the question. "Will you still want to see me when I come back trail worn and dusty?" "I will want to see you no matter what state you are in," Olivia said firmly. "You are not getting rid of me that easily, Franklin Voss." He laughed then, a full, genuine sound that made Olivia's heart soar. "I am holding you to that, Olivia Brennan." The next week and a half passed both too quickly and too slowly. Frank continued to help around the boarding house, but now there was a new dimension to their interactions. He would sometimes touch her hand as he passed, or let his fingers linger on her shoulder when he helped her move. In the evenings, he would sit closer to her, and sometimes, when the conversation lulled, Olivia would catch him looking at her with an expression of such open affection that it made her breath catch. 3 days before he was scheduled to leave, Frank helped her out to the front porch to sit in the evening air. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and the heat of the day was finally beginning to fade. Frank settled into the chair beside her, and they sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the town slow down for the night. "I am going to miss this," Frank said quietly. "Miss sitting with you like this, talking about nothing and everything." "I am going to miss you," Olivia replied. "These weeks have been difficult in many ways, but they have also been wonderful because of you." Frank turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes looked more gray than blue. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth and handed it to her. "It is not much, but I wanted you to have it." Olivia unwrapped the cloth carefully and found herself holding a smooth river stone about the size of a silver dollar. It was dark gray with veins of white running through it, polished to a soft sheen. "I found it in the creek bed up by the ranch years ago," Frank explained. "Always carried it with me, kind of a good luck charm. I know it is nothing fancy, but I thought maybe you could keep it while I am gone, and then when I come back you can give it back to me. That way, you know I am coming back for sure." Olivia closed her hand around the stone, feeling its weight and warmth. It was the most precious gift anyone had ever given her because it represented something real and lasting, a promise of return, a token of faith in their future together. "I will treasure it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I will give it back to you the moment you return." Frank reached out and cupped her face gently with one hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Can I kiss you?" he asked softly. "Yes," Olivia breathed. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she did not want to change her mind. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a kiss full of promise and possibility. Olivia's hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, and she leaned into him, wanting to memorize this moment, this feeling. When they finally pulled apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "I am definitely coming back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing is going to keep me away from you." "You better," Olivia said, trying for lightness even though her heart felt too full for her chest. "Because I am going to be waiting right here." The day Frank left for the cattle drive, Olivia stood on the porch with her crutch, her leg still tender but healing well. He had packed his bedroll and saddlebags the night before, and now his horse stood saddled and ready in front of the boarding house. He had delayed his departure as long as possible, but the trail boss would not wait any longer. "You are sure you will be all right?" Frank asked for the third time that morning. "I will be fine," Olivia assured him. "My knee is healing well, and I can manage most things now. Mrs. Henderson from the general store has offered to check in on me regularly, and Mr. Fletcher is here if I need anything." Frank nodded but did not look entirely convinced. He reached out and took both of her hands in his expression serious. "I will write when I can. The trail boss usually sends someone back to town every few weeks with messages. You will let me know if anything happens, if you need anything." "I promise," Olivia said. "Now go before your boss decides to leave without you." Frank pulled her close, mindful of her injured leg, and kissed her soundly. "I will be back before you know it," he said against her lips. "And when I get back, we are going to talk about the future, about what comes next for us." "I will be counting the days," Olivia said. She watched him mount his horse and ride away down the dusty street, watched until he was nothing but a speck in the distance, and then stood there a while longer until even the speck had disappeared. Only then did she let the tears fall, silent tears of sadness at his departure, but also of hope for his return. The next 2 months were the longest of Olivia's life. Her leg healed slowly but surely, and by the end of the first month, she was able to walk without the crutch, though she still favored the injured leg and tired easily. She threw herself into the work of running the boarding house, taking on 2 new boarders, and even managing to attract a few travelers who stayed for a few days at a time. True to his word, Frank sent messages whenever the trail boss sent someone back to town. The letters were not long, but they were filled with details about the drive, about the weather and the landscape and the challenges they faced. More importantly, they were filled with expressions of his feelings for her, assurances that he thought of her constantly and was counting the days until he could return. Olivia wrote back equally often, telling him about the boarding house, about the people in town, about how much she missed him. She kept his river stone in her pocket during the day and under her pillow at night, a constant reminder of his promise to return. As summer turned to early autumn, Olivia found herself watching the road more frequently, hoping to see riders coming in from the range. The cattle drive should be ending soon, and Frank had said in his last letter that he expected to be back by mid-September at the latest. It was the third week of September when Mrs. Henderson came running to the boarding house, her face flushed with excitement. "They are back," she called out. "The cattle drive is back. I just saw them coming into town from the north." Olivia's heart leapt into her throat. She quickly checked her appearance in the mirror, smoothed down her dress, and made her way out to the porch as fast as her still healing leg would allow. She stood there, gripping the railing, scanning the street for any sign of Frank. And then she saw him, riding at the back of a group of dusty, tired-looking cowboys. He was thinner than she remembered, his face more weathered from months in the sun and wind. But his eyes, when they found her standing on the porch, lit up with such joy that Olivia felt her own eyes fill with tears. Frank dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and crossed the distance between them in long strides. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her startled laugh, and then set her down carefully, mindful of her leg. "You are here," he said, his voice rough. "You are really here." "I told you I would be waiting," Olivia said, reaching up to touch his face to assure herself that he was real and solid and finally back. "I missed you so much." "I missed you more," Frank said, and then he was kissing her, right there on the porch in front of anyone who cared to watch, kissing her like a man who had been starving and finally found sustenance. Olivia kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapped around his neck, not caring about propriety or gossip or anything except the fact that he was home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out the river stone she had mailed back to him in her last letter. "I told you I would come back for this," he said with a grin. "And I told you I would be here," Olivia replied. Frank took her hand and led her to sit on the porch steps, settling beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "I did a lot of thinking on the trail," he said. "About what I want, about what kind of life I want to build. And the conclusion I came to is that nothing matters if you are not part of it." Olivia's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Frank, let me finish," he said gently. "I talked to my boss when we got back to the ranch. He is willing to let me work as foreman for his operation here in Nevada, based out of the ranch north of town. It would mean better pay, and I would not have to go on the long drives anymore. I would be close enough to come into town regularly, close enough to court you properly." "That sounds wonderful," Olivia said, hardly daring to hope. "There is more," Frank continued. He shifted to face her more fully, taking both of her hands in his. "I have been saving money for years, and between what I have saved and what I will make as foreman, I have enough to buy a piece of land. Nothing big, but enough to build a house on, to start building a life. And I want to build that life with you, Olivia. I know we have not known each other long, and I know this is fast, but I have never been more certain of anything. I love you. I think I started loving you that first day when I saw you lying hurt in the street and knew I could not walk away. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Olivia's face now, tears of pure happiness. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you too, Frank. I think I have loved you since you promised to carry me home." Frank let out a whoop of joy that startled a dog sleeping nearby and pulled Olivia into his arms again. They sat there on the porch steps, holding each other and laughing and crying, and Olivia thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. She had come to Nevada expecting nothing and had nearly lost everything in a single moment of bad luck. But that same moment had brought her Frank, had brought her love and hope, and a future she had never imagined possible. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Mrs. Henderson and Sarah Collins helped Olivia make a dress from a bolt of cream-colored fabric, and Frank wore a new suit that he was clearly uncomfortable in, but endured for her sake. Doc Patterson gave Olivia away, and Mr. Fletcher stood up as Frank's best man, and the preacher performed the ceremony with his gentle, practiced voice. Olivia's leg had healed enough by then that she could walk down the aisle without limping too badly, though Frank still kept a careful eye on her throughout the ceremony, ready to support her if she needed it. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Frank kissed her, the small gathering of townspeople cheered, and Olivia felt like the luckiest woman alive. They spent their wedding night in the room that Frank had first rented at the boarding house, the same room he had stayed in while taking care of her all those months ago. It felt right somehow, coming full circle to the place where their story had really begun. "I have been thinking about the boarding house," Frank said later, as they lay in bed together, Olivia's head resting on his chest and his arm wrapped securely around her. "We could keep it running if you want, bring in some steady income while we build up the ranch. Or if you would rather, we could sell it and use the money to invest in cattle and land. It is your property, so it is your decision." Olivia considered this. The boarding house had been her lifeline when she had nothing else, but it had also been a burden, a constant struggle to keep afloat. "I think I would like to sell it," she said slowly. "I am grateful for what it provided, but I am ready for something new. I want to build a future with you, not cling to the past." "Then we will put it up for sale," Frank agreed. "And in the meantime, we will start working on the house. I already have the land picked out about 2 miles from the main ranch. There is a creek running through it and a stand of trees that will provide good shade. I think you will love it." "I know I will," Olivia said. "As long as you are there, it will be perfect." The boarding house sold within a month to a couple from California who were looking to start a new life in Nevada. The sale provided enough money for Frank and Olivia to buy materials for their house and to purchase a small starter herd of cattle. Frank's boss, a man named James Thornton, was supportive of their plans and even offered to let Frank graze his cattle with the main herd until they had enough land to support them independently. They broke ground on the house in early December, and Frank, with the help of several men from the ranch, worked through the winter to get the basic structure completed. It was a modest house by any standard, just 4 rooms and a porch, but it was solid and well built, and Frank took pride in every nail he drove and every board he placed. Olivia spent the winter months living in a small cabin on the ranch property that Mr. Thornton made available to them, and she used the time to sew curtains and plan the garden she would plant in the spring. She also discovered, to her joy and slight trepidation, that she was pregnant. She told Frank on a cold January evening when he came back to the cabin exhausted from a day of working on the house. He had been worried because she seemed nervous all through dinner, and when she finally found the courage to tell him, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down and apologized, worried he had been too rough. "I am having a baby," he said, as if testing out the words. "We are going to be parents." "Yes," Olivia said, laughing at his dazed expression. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Frank pulled her close, his hand coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Olivia, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. We are going to have a family." The baby was born in August, a little boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. They named him Thomas Franklin Voss, and Frank held his son with such tender care that Olivia fell in love with him all over again. She watched her husband rock their baby, singing old cowboy songs in his low, rumbling voice, and thought about how far they had both come from that day in the street when she had fallen, and he had knelt down to help her. By the time Thomas was a year old, the house was completely finished and furnished, the garden was flourishing, and their cattle herd had grown to 30 head. It was not a fortune, but it was a solid foundation, and Frank and Olivia worked side by side to build on it. Life on the ranch was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way that Olivia had never experienced before. She learned to ride a horse properly, to help with the branding and herding when extra hands were needed, to manage the household finances and keep the ranch running smoothly. Frank proved to be as good a husband as he had been a caretaker, always supportive, always willing to listen, always ready with a helping hand or a word of encouragement. They had a daughter 2 years after Thomas was born, a little girl they named Emma after Frank's sister. Frank wept when Olivia told him her choice for the name, and he held baby Emma with a mixture of joy and sorrow, mourning the sister he had lost while celebrating the daughter he had gained. As the years passed, Unionville continued its slow decline, but the Voss ranch prospered. They expanded their land holdings gradually, adding a few acres here and there as they could afford it, building their herd until they had over 100 head of quality cattle. They became respected members of the ranching community, known for their fair dealing and hard work. Thomas grew into a strong, capable boy who loved helping his father with the cattle, and Emma proved to have her mother's head for numbers and organization. Frank built an addition onto the house to give the children more space, and then, when Olivia found herself pregnant again at 32, he added another room for the new baby. This third child was another boy named William, and he completed their family. Frank was 42 by then, his dark hair starting to show threads of silver, and Olivia sometimes caught him moving more slowly after a long day's work. But he was still the same man who had knelt beside her in the street and promised to carry her home, still the man who looked at her with love in his eyes every single day. One evening, when William was 5 and the older children were helping finish evening chores, Olivia and Frank sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the mountains. It was a scene they had repeated countless times over the years, a quiet moment of peace at the end of a busy day. "Do you ever think about that day in town?" Olivia asked, her hand finding Frank's. "The day I fell," Frank squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes, usually when I am counting my blessings and wondering what I did to deserve this life. I think about it often," Olivia admitted. "I think about how scared I was, lying there in the dust, thinking I was going to die alone in a town where nobody cared. And then you appeared and everything changed." "You changed everything for me too," Frank said quietly. "I was just drifting before I met you, going through the motions of living but not really feeling much of anything. You woke me up, reminded me what it felt like to care about someone, to want to build something that mattered." Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and hay and sunshine. "I fell and you carried me home, and you never put me down again." Frank pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I never will. You are stuck with me, Olivia Voss." "Good," she said. "I would not want to be anywhere else." They sat in companionable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear. Inside the house, they could hear the children's voices, Thomas teaching William how to tie a proper knot while Emma read aloud from a book. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life built on love and hard work and faith in each other. 20 years after that day in the street, Frank and Olivia celebrated their anniversary with a dinner attended by their grown children and their families. Thomas had married a rancher's daughter from the next county over and had given them 2 grandchildren already. Emma had surprised them all by becoming a teacher in the town that had sprung up near their ranch, a town that was thriving unlike poor, dying Unionville. William was still at home, learning the ranching business and showing every sign of taking over the operation when Frank was ready to slow down. As Olivia looked around the table at her children and grandchildren, at Frank sitting at the head of the table with silver in his hair but love still bright in his eyes, she felt overwhelming gratitude for the path her life had taken. She had come to Nevada expecting nothing and had nearly lost everything. But in the dust of a dying mining town, she had found a man who taught her that love was not just about the grand gestures but about the daily choice to show up, to help, to carry each other through the hard times. Frank caught her looking at him and raised his glass. "To my wife," he said, his voice strong and steady even after all these years. "To the woman who fell and let me catch her, who trusted me to carry her home, and who has been home to me ever since. I love you today as much as I loved you that first day, maybe more." "To love," Olivia said, raising her own glass, her eyes bright with happy tears. "And to the man who taught me that falling down is not the end of the story, but sometimes the beginning of the best chapter." They drank, and their family cheered, and later, when the party was over and they were alone again in the house they had built together, Frank took Olivia in his arms and held her close. "No regrets?" he asked, as he sometimes still did after all these years. "Not a single one," Olivia said firmly. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "You did the same for me," Frank said. "My Emma would have liked you, would have been happy that I found someone to love." "I hope so," Olivia said. "I hope she knows that her loss led to so much life, so much happiness. That in a way she brought us together." They stood there in the house they had built, holding each other as they had done countless times before. Two people who had found each other in a moment of crisis and had chosen every day since to keep finding each other again. Outside, the Nevada night was vast and star-filled, full of possibility and promise, just like the future they had built together. Frank Voss had knelt down beside a fallen woman one dusty afternoon in 1877 and said, "I will carry you home now." He had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined, carrying her not just physically but through life, through hardship and joy, through the building of a ranch and a family, and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. And Olivia had let herself be carried, had trusted this cowboy with the sad eyes and gentle hands, and in doing so had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to accept help, to let someone else share your burdens, to believe that love can grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Their story became a legend in their family, told and retold to children and grandchildren, the tale of how Grandma fell and Grandpa carried her home. But the real story was not just about that single moment, but about all the moments that followed, all the days when they chose each other, all the times they lifted each other up and carried each other through whatever challenges life presented. Frank Voss had promised to carry Olivia Brennan home, and he spent the rest of his life keeping that promise, and in the end, home was not a place but a person, not a destination but a journey they took together, side by side, for all the years they were given. They had fallen and risen together, and in the rising, they had found everything that mattered, a love that sustained them through every season, every challenge, every joy and sorrow that life in the Wild West brought their way. Their children and grandchildren would remember them not as a woman who fell and a man who helped her up, but as two souls who found each other when they needed it most and built something beautiful from that chance encounter. They remembered laughter around the dinner table, quiet moments on the porch, the way Frank would still take Olivia's hand when they walked together, The way Olivia would still look at Frank with love in her eyes after 50 years of marriage. When Frank finally passed at the age of 78, Olivia held his hand and whispered, "Thank you for carrying me home." And Frank, with his last bit of strength, squeezed her hand and whispered back, "Thank you for letting me." Olivia lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a family that had grown from that single moment of kindness in a dusty street. She spent those years telling stories, passing on wisdom, making sure that everyone knew how much she had loved their grandfather, how grateful she was for the life they had built together. When she finally joined Frank, she was buried beside him on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstones were simple, just their names and dates and a single inscription that their children had chosen. She fell, and he carried her home. Together, they built a life worth living. And in the end, that was the truest summary of their story, a tale of love born from compassion, of a life built on kindness and trust and the daily choice to care for each other. They had started with nothing but a chance encounter and a willingness to help, and from that, they had created something that lasted, a legacy of love that would continue for generations. A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of reaching out a hand to someone who has fallen and saying, "I will help you. I will carry you home." The ranch they built continued to thrive under William's management, and his children and their children kept it going, each generation adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Frank and Olivia had laid. The original house, the one Frank had built with his own hands during that long-ago winter, was preserved and maintained, a museum of sorts for the family, filled with the simple furniture and belongings that Frank and Olivia had accumulated over their years together. And on the mantel in that house, in a place of honor, sat a smooth river stone, dark gray with veins of white running through it, a stone that had once been a promise, a token of faith, a symbol of a love that had endured through everything the Wild West could throw at them. Visitors would ask about the stone, and whoever was giving the tour would smile and say, "That is where it all began. That is the stone that brought them together and kept them together. That is the stone that proves that sometimes falling down is exactly what you need to do to find your way home."